So by this point you should have read chapters 1 and 2, looked at the PowerPoint slides that are available on Blackboard Learn, and I'm going to now just give a kind of basic overview of what it is that we're doing in this course and hit a couple of the highlights from those chapters. Now I know there's a lot of information here, and I think what's important is that you see the information in the textbook a couple of times before we actually come and talk about the stuff that's really really important. So that's what we're going to do here, and we're going to start out by talking about first of all, what is statistics? And there are a few videos on the web that have to do with the expert, how Star Wars should have ended, and then did you know? And all three of those videos, I think, help us understand what it is that we're trying to do with statistics and why we're trying to understand numbers and what we can do with those things. But they don't really necessarily answer the question of what is statistics. And so statistics is defined as the science of collecting, organizing, analyzing, interpreting, and presenting data. And the argument that I'll make for the need to do that can best be understood if you go back and look at the video on the Did You Know video. It talks about the amount of data that's being generated, the unique amounts of data being generated every single year, and how that's growing exponentially. And the question then becomes, how do you do all of these things right here, the collecting, the organizing, the analyzing, interpreting, and presenting of all of that data, and why do you want to do that? And the clear answer should be that the reason for doing those things is so that you can understand what the data is telling you. In other words, what information is there that's contained in the data that you can use to make your life better, or the life of your family or your friends, or the life of your business better. How do you make decisions based on that information? And so these tools that we have, the collecting, organizing, analyzing, and interpreting, are just that. They're tools, and we need to learn how to use them properly. If you don't know how to use the tools properly, then you might be able to get done what it is that you want to do, but probably not in the most efficient and effective manner. And so that's what statistics is. A statistic, we use the word statistic a lot. It has several different meanings. A statistic is a single measure used to summarize a sample data set. For example, the average height of students at a university is a statistic. You hear these all the time. People refer to sports statistics, how many free throws, the average free throw percentage for a particular player or team, or the number of the batting average for a baseball player. We also hear all sorts of other statistics when it comes to business, and those are very useful and informative, but if they're taken out of context, it can be hard to understand what all they are telling us. And so what we're going to need is what I call the big picture of statistics. The big picture of statistics goes like this. If I have a population, and I'm interested in the characteristics of this population, okay, if it's a population that's worth anything, it's going to be a large population. In other words, if there's going to be money to be extracted from this population, it's going to have to be a very large population in general for me to be able to do that. And so the idea is I want to know what the characteristics of this population are. So I have characteristics characteristics of a population are something that are called parameters. And these are special things. In fact, they're so special that we use Greek letters to denote them. We have things like mu, pi, sigma, theta, and so forth. And these are characteristics of the population. So if we know what the characteristics of the population are, then we know actually quite a bit about the population. We can use that to make decisions in terms of how much of a product to produce, who to try and sell our product to, what price we should charge for our product, and so forth. All of that can be decided if we know what the characteristics are. Now the problem comes in that parameters, being characteristics of populations, are actually, at least if it's a large population, they're unknowable and they're unknown. So in other words, I can't know exactly what the average, or mu, is for the population unless I can take a census of the entire population. And that's generally not something that we can do for interesting populations because it's too time consuming, too expensive, and oftentimes by the time we're done taking the census, the population has changed. So instead of doing that, we are going to use something called probability. And probability allows us to make statements about a sample. So we're going to take a population. From that population, we're going to take a sample. If we know what the characteristics of the population are, then we can use probability to make statements about how likely the sample is that we observe. And this is the study of probability, and that's a big part of what we're doing in this class. So we're going to spend the first few weeks of this class studying probability, learning things about random variables and randomness and how to count and some very interesting things, because those things form the basis for what we call statistical inference. Or rather, let's call it inferential statistics. So what's going on here is when we take a sample, we get characteristics of the sample, and those are actually called statistics. And these are things like X bar, P, S, T, and so forth. They're not Greek letters, they're Roman letters, but they correspond to the Greek letters. And the sample characteristics, or statistics, allow us to make statements about the population characteristics. And this inferential statistics is done by what we call making confidence intervals and hypothesis testing. And so once we get to the point where we understand probability and we're able to make statements about the sample that we observe, given that we know what the parameters are, then we can start to make statements about the parameters based on the sample using this notion of confidence intervals and hypothesis testing. And that's really the big picture of where we are going. That's the roadmap of where we're going in this course. We're going to start out with probability. We're going to move on to inferential statistics, and everything else kind of fills in the details there. So confidence intervals, hypothesis testing, those are both types of inferential statistical methods, and they're very much dependent on probability. So if you ever get stuck in this class and you're trying to decide or trying to figure out what it is that we're doing, think of this picture, draw this picture out, and see if you can't put the problem that you are faced with in context of this picture, and hopefully that will help you understand what's going on. And turns out that this is something that we're going to see over and over and over again, and we're going to do it repeatedly. And when you get into the next stat course that you take, and there surely will be another stat course that you take at some point in your life, if you go to graduate school or postgraduate school or whatever it is, this stuff's not going away. There's so much information, so much data out there, and the business world really depends on all that data. You need to learn how to do this stuff, and the more you see it, the more you do it, the better you're going to become at it. So there are a couple of definitions that we want to talk about when it comes to describing the sample that we take. The first one is is what we call an observation. An observation is a single member of a collection of items that we want to study, such as a person, a firm, or a region. A variable is a characteristic of the subject or individual, such as the income or the amount on an invoice. And a data set consists of all the values of all the variables, the observations that we have chosen to observe. So a variable, again, is a characteristic of an individual, and that should be something that we can relate to a population or a sample. When we, on the previous slide, talked about a parameter or a statistic. There are certain types of data that we're going to be using. The easiest way to think of them is what we call categorical or qualitative data, and numeric or quantitative data. And the textbook talks quite a bit about this stuff. I'm not going to go into in too much detail, but we will use both of these types considerably, especially the quantitative types over here. And it turns out there's two types of quantitative variables that or data that we're really going to focus on. The first one is what we call discrete, and the other one is what we call continuous. And we'll talk more about what those things are a little bit later in class. Another thing that we look at is the level of measurement when it comes to a variable. And the first question we need to ask is whether there is a natural data ordering. If there's not, then we have nominal data. These would be things like the type of a company that you have, sole proprietor, corporation, partnership, and so forth. There's no natural ordering there. If there is a natural ordering, then we say their meaning to the distance between the values the variable can take on. So we have ordinal data, which says there is an ordering, but the distance between the first and the second is not necessarily the same as between the second and the third. And if there is a meaningful distance on the scale, then we ask the question, is there a meaningful 0 point? If there is no meaningful 0 point, something like temperature, 0 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't mean that there is 0 temperature, it just means the temperature is 0. But you can have negative temperatures, and doesn't mean there's a lack of temperature. At 0 degrees, it's just a number that goes along with a certain level of energy in the system, and that's what we would call interval data. If there is a meaningful 0, then we have ratio data. So that could be something like the amount of money in a bank account. It could be 0. If that's the case, $0 means $0, and that would be an example of ratio data. So this is kind of just a brief highlight of some of the stuff from Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The other things you're going to want to look at are the videos that are in the Week 1 folder. So I think some of them are kind of humorous, some of them are maybe a little more serious, but hopefully they're informative and will help you get excited about what we're doing in this class. And so for this week, the main thing that you need to do is make sure you get access to the course website through Blackboard Learn and the Connect site, and start working on the homework number 1, which should be pretty straightforward. And send me email if you have any questions. Thanks, and we'll see you next week.